Montana Territory, 1878. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass as the last light of day painted the vast Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Violet Turner stood at the edge of a weathered grave, her 22-year-old shoulders bearing weight beyond their years. Her honey-blonde hair whipped across her face, partially obscuring the tear tracks that glistened on her cheeks. "I promise I will find a way," she whispered to the crude wooden cross bearing her husband's name. "For us, for the children." 6 months a widow, with twin babies barely 8 months old, Violet had discovered just how quickly a woman alone could fall from respected wife to object of pity and predation. The harsh frontier that had once seemed full of promise now threatened to consume her entirely. She believed it to the core of her being. The frontier took everything you loved and left you hollow. Love was a luxury the West could not sustain. Survival was all that mattered now. Adjusting the worn shawl around her shoulders, Violet turned away from the grave and walked the half-mile back to the tiny cabin she could no longer afford to keep. Tomorrow she would leave this place forever, seeking work at the Diamond D Ranch where she'd been told they needed someone to clean their barns and outbuildings. It was menial work, far beneath what she'd known as the educated daughter of a shopkeeper back east, but it came with a small cabin for her and the twins. The world had taught her harshly that dreams were for the protected and privileged. Out here, you took what you could get and hardened yourself against hoping for more. Isaac Dalton studied the mountain ridges surrounding his ranch, with the vigilance that had kept him alive for 26 years in Montana Territory. The Diamond D spread was the culmination of 8 years of backbreaking work, smart investments, and calculated risks. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, 300 head of cattle, a sprawling ranch house, and now a growing reputation as one of the most promising cattle operations in the territory. He had everything a man could want out here, everything except someone to share it with. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the distant dust cloud that signaled an approaching wagon. The new barn cleaner, most likely. His foreman had hired some widow woman desperate for work. No attachments, he reminded himself firmly. It was the code he'd lived by since watching his parents' marriage disintegrate under the pressure of frontier life. His mother had eventually abandoned them both, unable to withstand the isolation and hardship. His father had drunk himself to death within 2 years. The lesson had been crystal clear: love had no place on the frontier. It was a distraction, a weakness that would only lead to failure and heartbreak. The successful men out here were the ones who understood that building something lasting required single-minded dedication. Isaac turned his horse back toward the ranch house. He had a cattle buyer coming tomorrow and ledgers to review tonight. The widow and her situation were none of his concern beyond making sure she did the job she was hired for. The Diamond D Ranch loomed before Violet like something from another world. The main house was 2 stories of solid craftsmanship with a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings stood in neat arrangement: a bunkhouse, cookhouse, blacksmith shop, and the largest barn she'd ever seen. It was a kingdom unto itself, speaking of wealth and permanence she could scarcely comprehend. Her wagon creaked to a halt near the bunkhouse where a gray-haired man with a weathered face approached. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked, removing his hat. "Yes," she replied, gathering her sleeping daughter Emma into her arms while her son Ethan continued to sleep on the wagon seat.
"Mr. Peterson."
"That's right, ranch foreman." He glanced at the children with poorly disguised concern. "Boss didn't mention there'd be little ones." Violet felt her spine stiffen. "I mentioned them to you when we spoke. They're quiet and won't interfere with my work." Peterson scratched his chin. "Well, what's done is done. I'll show you to your quarters. It ain't much, but it's got a roof that don't leak." The cabin sat 100 yards behind the main house, a single room with a small cast iron stove, a bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a wash basin. Compared to what she'd been living in these past months, it seemed more than adequate. "Barn needs cleaning every morning before the hands take out the horses," Peterson explained. "Chicken coop needs tending twice daily. Cook might need help with laundry and such when you're done with your regular duties." "I understand," Violet said, settling the twins on the bed. "When should I begin?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Peterson replied, then hesitated. "Mrs. Turner, the boss, Mr. Dalton, he runs a tight operation here, doesn't like complications." The implication was clear: keep the children out of the way, don't become a problem. "My children and I won't be a complication, Mr. Peterson. We're simply grateful for the opportunity." After he left, Violet sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of weakness. a single tear sliding down her cheek. 22 years old, widowed with 2 babies depending on her. This was her life now, cleaning barns and staying invisible. "We'll be all right," she whispered to her sleeping twins. "We'll survive this place. That's all that matters now." For 2 weeks, Isaac managed to avoid more than a passing glance at the widow. He saw her from a distance, small and determined, moving between the barn and her cabin, always with purpose in her step. Occasionally, he caught sight of 2 small bundles, the children he hadn't known about until after she'd arrived. He told himself her situation wasn't his concern. She did her job well. Peterson had reported that the barn had never been cleaner, and she'd taken on additional duties without complaint. That was all he needed to know. Until the morning he entered the barn at dawn and found her asleep on a pile of clean straw, a baby nestled in each arm. He stood frozen, an unexpected tightness in his chest. Her honey-blonde hair had come loose from its practical bun, spilling across the straw like spun gold. Her face, relaxed in sleep, revealed a beauty that hardship had not yet erased. She couldn't have been much more than 20. One of the babies, he couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl, made a small sound, and Isaac watched as she instinctively pulled the child closer even in sleep. Something twisted inside him, something he'd thought long dead. He cleared his throat. Violet's eyes flew open, instantly alert. When she saw him standing there, she scrambled to her feet, clutching the babies to her chest. "Mr. Dalton, I'm so sorry, I finished cleaning early and sat down just for a moment."
Mrs.
"Turner," he interrupted, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Are you sleeping in the barn?" Color flooded her cheeks. "No, sir, I have the cabin you provided, She looked down at the twins. "Emma had a fever last night. The only thing that soothes her is movement, so I walked with them until she settled. I didn't want to start the cleaning too early and wake your men, so we waited here." Isaac found himself studying the tiny face of the feverish child. Pink-cheeked and fair-haired like her mother, with eyes that were beginning to open, revealing a startling blue. "You should have said something," he said, more gruffly than intended. "Mrs. Abernathy has remedies for childhood fevers." "I didn't want to trouble anyone," she replied, dignity evident in her straight spine despite her exhaustion. "We manage on our own." Those words, a declaration of independence but also an admission of profound isolation, struck him unexpectedly hard. How many times had he said some version of the same thing? "What are their names?" he found himself asking. Surprise flickered across her face. "Emma and Ethan, they're 8 months old." "Twins," he nodded, uncomfortable with the conversation yet unwilling to end it. "That must be difficult for you, being alone." "We manage," she repeated, then seemed to remember her position. "I've finished the barn cleaning, Mr. Dalton. Was there something else you needed?" The sudden formality reminded him of boundaries he himself maintained. He stepped back, reclaiming his role as employer. "No, Mrs. Turner. That will be all." As he watched her gather her things and make her way back to her cabin, the twins balanced expertly in her arms, Isaac felt a crack in the foundation of beliefs he'd built his life upon. The sight of her sleeping with those babies had awakened something he'd long suppressed, a longing for connection, for family. "Distraction," he muttered to himself, turning away. "Nothing but a distraction." 3 days later, Violet was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she saw the boss's tall figure approaching on horseback. Her hands froze on the wet cloth. In their brief time at the Diamond D, she'd managed to avoid direct contact with Isaac Dalton after their uncomfortable encounter in the barn. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Up close, she couldn't help noticing his features, strong jawline softened by lips that seemed inclined to smile though they rarely did, eyes the color of a summer storm, and dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Mrs. Turner," he greeted, removing his hat. "Mr. Dalton," she wiped her hands on her apron, "is there something wrong with my work?" He shook his head. "On the contrary, Peterson says you're the most efficient barn hand we've ever had." The compliment surprised her. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. Violet waited, aware of the wet laundry dripping onto her skirts and the twins napping precariously close to waking in their makeshift cradle nearby. Finally, Isaac cleared his throat. "I've brought something for your daughter, for her fever." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small bottle, Mrs. Abernathy's willow bark tincture. "Works wonders according to the hands with families." Violet stared at the bottle, then at him, genuine confusion washing over her. "That's very kind, but—" "It's nothing," he said quickly. "Can't have my workers distracted by sick children." The words were practical, even cold, but something in his eyes conveyed a different message. Violet accepted the bottle, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Thank you," she said softly. "Emma's fever broke yesterday, but I'll keep this for next time." He nodded, then glanced toward the makeshift cradle, where Emma and Ethan slept on a blanket in the shade of the cabin's small porch. "They're growing well," he observed, surprising her again with his attention. "Yes, despite everything," she answered before she could stop herself. His eyes returned to her face, and something in their depths made her wish she could take back the words that revealed too much vulnerability. "How long has it been," he asked quietly, "since your husband?" "6 months," she replied, looking away. "Influenza, it took him in 3 days." Isaac shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the topic, yet seemingly unable to retreat from it. "You're very young to be facing this alone. The frontier doesn't care about age, Mr. Dalton. It takes what it wants and leaves the rest of us to adapt or perish." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Instead of being put off, Isaac seemed to understand completely. "That's true enough." A cry from the cradle broke the moment. Ethan had awakened and was beginning to fuss, which would soon wake his sister. Violet moved automatically toward her children. "I should let you get back to your duties," Isaac said, replacing his hat. He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything else, for the children, you can ask Peterson to let me know." With that unexpected offer hanging in the air between them, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Violet staring after him in confusion. Isaac couldn't explain, even to himself, why he found himself riding past the widow's cabin each evening on his way back from checking the north pasture. It wasn't necessary, there were more direct routes to the main house, but something compelled him to make the detour. Most evenings he caught glimpses of her domestic routine, hanging laundry, feeding the twins in the doorway to catch the last light of day. Once he heard singing, a sweet, clear voice offering a lullaby that carried on the evening breeze. These moments stirred something in him that he deliberately kept dormant, a yearning, a possibility, a question about whether the code he'd lived by was truly the only way to survive out here. On the 5th evening of his unnecessary detour, he found her struggling with the small woodpile behind her cabin. The twins were secured in a wooden box nearby, watching their mother with wide eyes as she attempted to split logs with an axe too large for her frame. Without considering the implications, Isaac dismounted and approached. "Mrs. Turner, let me help with that." She startled, nearly dropping the axe. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't see you there." "That axe is too heavy for you," he said, reaching for the tool. Their hands brushed again, and he noticed calluses forming on her once smooth palms. "You should have asked for a proper splitting axe." "I didn't want to be a bother," she replied, relinquishing the axe. "The nights are getting colder, and the twins need a warm cabin." Isaac made quick work of the logs, aware of her watching him. The physical labor felt good after a day of business concerns, and there was satisfaction in doing something concrete to improve her situation. When he finished, he found her offering a cup of water. He accepted gratefully, noticing the neat stitching on her simple dress, the way she'd arranged her hair practically but still attractively, the gentle curve of her neck as she looked toward her children. "Thank you," she said when he handed back the cup. "That would have taken me all night." "You shouldn't be doing men's work," he found himself saying, "not with those two to care for." Something flashed in her eyes, pride or perhaps defiance. "Out here, Mr. Dalton, there's no such thing as men's work or women's work. There's only what needs doing and whether you're strong enough to do it." The words struck him as profoundly true. He studied her more carefully, seeing beyond the initial impression of vulnerability to the steel beneath. This woman had buried her husband, traveled alone with infant twins, and taken work far beneath her obvious education and breeding, all to survive. "You're right, of course," he conceded, "but even the strongest need help sometimes." She looked away toward the setting sun. "Help comes with expectations, Mr. Dalton. I've learned that lesson well these past months." The implication was clear. As a widow, she'd likely faced unwanted advances from men offering help with strings attached. The thought stirred an unexpected protectiveness in him. "Not all help," he said quietly. Their eyes met and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared values despite their different circumstances. One of the twins, the boy, Ethan, chose that moment to let out a demanding cry. Violet moved toward the makeshift cradle, lifting him with practiced ease. "He's hungry," she explained, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "I should." "Of course," Isaac said, suddenly aware of the inappropriateness of his lingering. "Good evening, Mrs. Turner." As he rode back to the main house, Isaac found himself deeply unsettled. The widow and her twins were becoming more than a peripheral concern. They were becoming important to him personally, a dangerous development for a man who'd built his life around avoiding emotional entanglements. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward them, toward her. The first autumn storm arrived without warning, a driving rain that turned quickly to sleet as temperatures dropped. Violet huddled with the twins in their small cabin, grateful for the woodpile Isaac Dalton had prepared but increasingly concerned about the roof. Water dripped steadily from two corners, forming puddles on the dirt floor. She'd positioned buckets to catch the worst of it, but as night fell and the storm intensified, the leaks worsened. Emma and Ethan were restless, disturbed by the thunder and the cold draft that seeped through the cabin's poorly chinked logs. Violet had them bundled together in the center of the bed, away from the worst leaks, but there was no escaping the dampness and chill that permeated everything. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the small structure, and both twins began crying in earnest. Violet tried soothing them with songs and gentle rocking, but her own teeth were chattering too hard to sing properly. When a knock came at the door, she nearly cried with relief, assuming it was Mrs. Abernathy from the cookhouse checking on them. Instead, she found Isaac Dalton on her threshold, rain-soaked and grim-faced. "This cabin isn't safe tonight," he said without preamble, his eyes taking in the leaking roof and crying twins. "Gather what you need, you're coming to the main house." Violet hesitated, torn between desperate need and propriety. "Mr. Dalton, I couldn't possibly."
Mrs.
"Turner," he interrupted, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it, "that roof could collapse in this wind. I won't have you and your children at risk when there's perfectly good shelter available." As if to emphasize his point, a new leak sprang from the center of the ceiling, sending a stream of water onto the floor between them. "Quickly now," he urged, practicality won over pride. Violet wrapped the twins in their warmest blanket and gathered a small bundle of necessities. Isaac lifted the babies effortlessly, tucking them inside his coat to shield them from the rain while Violet covered her head with a shawl. They made their way through the downpour to the main house, where light and warmth beckoned from every window. Once inside, Violet stood dripping on the polished wooden floor of the entryway, momentarily overwhelmed by the contrast between this solid house and the leaking cabin. "Mrs. Abernathy," Isaac called, and the plump, gray-haired cook appeared from what must have been the kitchen. "Goodness gracious," she exclaimed, taking in the situation. "Those poor babies, and you're soaked through, the both of you. Come, come, there's hot stew on the stove and the fire's built up in the parlor." Isaac handed the twins to Mrs. Abernathy. "The guest room on the first floor is ready." "All made up with fresh linens," the cook confirmed, already moving toward the kitchen with the babies. "I'll get these little ones warmed up while you show Mrs. Turner where she'll be staying." Before Violet could protest or even process what was happening, Isaac was guiding her down a hallway to a spacious bedroom with a large four-poster bed and a fire already crackling in the hearth. "You'll be comfortable here," he said, standing awkwardly by the door. "There's a connecting door to a small sitting room where we can set up something for the twins." Violet looked around in disbelief. The room was larger than the entire cabin, furnished with pieces that would have graced a fine home back east. A copper bathtub stood in one corner, partially screened by a decorative panel. "This is too much," she managed. "It's shelter," he replied simply, "nothing more." But they both knew it was more. It was a gesture that crossed the careful boundary between employer and employee, between the ranch owner and the barn cleaner. "Mrs. Abernathy will bring you dry clothes and help with the children," Isaac continued. "When you're settled, come to the kitchen for something hot to eat." He turned to leave, then paused. "The cabin will be repaired properly tomorrow." "This is temporary, Mrs. Turner. There's no need for concern about appearances." With that, he was gone, leaving Violet standing amid luxury she hadn't experienced since leaving her father's home years ago. The storm raged for 3 days, making repairs to Violet's cabin impossible. For 3 nights, she and the twins occupied the guest room in Isaac Dalton's house, creating a strange domestic tableau that unsettled and attracted him in equal measure. Despite his best intentions to maintain distance, Isaac found himself drawn to the kitchen each evening where Violet sat with her children. Mrs. Abernathy, clearly delighted to have a young woman and babies in the house, fussed over all 3 of them shamelessly. On the 3rd evening, Isaac entered to find Violet alone at the kitchen table, mending one of the twins' small garments, while Mrs. Abernathy supervised their bath in a wooden tub near the stove. The weather's clearing, he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot on the stove. Peterson thinks they can start on your cabin tomorrow. Violet looked up from her stitching, and something in her expression made him add hastily, though there's no rush. You're welcome to stay until everything is properly dried out and repaired. You've been more than generous, she replied softly. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough. It's not an imposition. The words came out more forcefully than he intended. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and the moment stretched between them. In the background, he could hear the twins splashing and Mrs. Abernathy's gentle cooing, but they seemed to exist in another world entirely. Why did you help us? Violet asked suddenly. The night of the storm. You could have sent Peterson or one of the hands. The question caught him off guard. He'd been asking himself the same thing for 3 days. I was concerned, he said finally. About all of you. She studied him with those clear eyes that seemed to see too much. Most men in your position wouldn't concern themselves with a widow and her children. I'm not most men, he replied, then immediately felt foolish for the statement. But Violet didn't mock him. Instead, she set aside her sewing and faced him directly. No, she agreed quietly, you're not. Something changed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since their first encounter in the barn. Mrs. Abernathy's voice broke the spell. These little ones are clean as whistles and ready for their mama. Violet rose gracefully, moving to collect her freshly bathed children. Isaac watched as she gathered them close, pressing kisses to damp heads and breathing in their clean scent. The sight stirred longings he'd denied for years, for family, for connection, for a legacy beyond acres and cattle. Good night, mister. Dalton, Violet said, meeting his eyes once more as she carried the twins toward the guest room. And thank you for everything. After she left, Mrs. Abernathy busied herself wiping down the kitchen, humming contentedly. Nice to have young ones in the house, she commented, brings life to the place. Isaac grunted noncommittally, but the old woman wasn't fooled. She's a good woman, Mrs. Abernathy continued, strong, smart. Been through more than someone her age should have to bear, but hasn't let it break her. Mrs. Abernathy, Isaac warned, not wanting to discuss his growing feelings for Violet. The cook raised her hands in surrender. Just making an observation, Mr. Dalton, just making an observation. But her knowing smile followed him out of the kitchen and haunted his restless dreams that night. The repaired cabin was unquestionably better than before, new shingles, properly chinked logs, a small covered porch added to the front. But returning to it after 3 days in the main house felt like a step backward to Violet. Not because of the difference in luxury, though that was substantial, but because of the isolation. She missed Mrs. Abernathy's cheerful presence, the sense of being part of a household rather than apart from it. Most of all, though she scarcely admitted it to herself, she missed Isaac Dalton's evening appearances, his gruff concern, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. Life settled back into its routine. Violet cleaned the barn each morning, tended the chicken coop, helped with laundry, and cared for her growing twins. Isaac returned to keeping his distance, though occasionally she caught sight of him watching from afar or found small improvements to her situation that could only have come at his direction. A rocking chair that appeared on her porch, a small wagon perfect for transporting the twins, extra blankets delivered as the nights grew colder. October brought the cattle drive when half the hands departed to take the herd to the railroad at Helena. The ranch grew quieter, the work more concentrated among those who remained. Violet found herself taking on additional duties, helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare meals for the remaining hands and assisting with butchering and preserving meat for the coming winter. It was during this busy time that disaster struck. Violet had just finished the barn cleaning and was hurrying back to check on the twins, who were being watched by Mrs. Abernathy while she worked, when she heard shouting from the direction of the north pasture. A rider was approaching at dangerous speed, and even from a distance, Violet could see the urgency in his posture. As he drew closer, she recognized Peterson, the foreman, his usually composed face tight with concern. Fire, he shouted as he thundered past her toward the main house. Northridge's burning, rouse everyone. The word sent ice through Violet's veins. Fire was the most feared disaster on the plains, capable of destroying everything in its path with terrifying speed. She ran to the main house, bursting into the kitchen where Mrs. Abernathy sat with the twins. There's a fire, she gasped. Peterson just rode in. The older woman paled. Lord help us, where? Northridge, I'm going to help.
Please watch the twins.
Without waiting for response, Violet ran back outside where men were already gathering, loading water barrels onto wagons and collecting tools. Isaac stood in the center, issuing rapid commands, his face grim with concentration. When he saw Violet approaching, his expression darkened. "Mrs. Turner, get back to the house." "I want to help," she insisted, grabbing a shovel from a nearby pile. "This isn't women's work," he snapped, echoing her own words back at her. "It's too dangerous." "There's only what needs doing and whether you're strong enough to do it," she replied steadily, meeting his eyes without flinching. For a moment they stood locked in a battle of wills. Then Peterson called urgently from a wagon already loaded with water barrels and tools, and Isaac relented. "Stay with the water wagon," he ordered. "Don't go near the fire line itself. Your job is to keep the water flowing to the men fighting directly." It was a compromise, and Violet accepted it with a nod, climbing onto the wagon with several other workers. The North Ridge was ablaze when they arrived, flames leaping from tree to tree and racing through the dry underbrush. The Diamond D hands, joined by men from neighboring ranches who'd spotted the smoke, were digging fire breaks and felling trees to create a barrier against the advancing flames. Violet worked tirelessly, filling buckets and canteens, helping to soak blankets that men wrapped around themselves for protection as they ventured closer to the flames. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, but she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that the ranch, and everyone on it, depended on stopping the fire before it reached the valley floor. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of Isaac moving among the firefighters, his shirt soaked with sweat, face blackened with soot, yet never faltering as he directed men and worked alongside them, digging fire breaks with the same vigor as any hand. Hours passed in a blur of heat, smoke, and desperate effort. Just when it seemed they might be gaining ground, the wind shifted, sending flames leaping over a section of the fire break they'd established. "Fall back," Isaac shouted.
Regroup at the creek line.
Men scrambled to retrieve tools and retreat before the advancing fire. Violet was helping load the last of the water barrels when she heard a terrified whinnying. Through the smoke, she spotted a horse trapped between fallen trees, frantically trying to escape as flames approached. Without thinking, she dropped the barrel and ran toward the animal. It was one of Isaac's prized mares, she realized, Diamond's Lady, the horse he was planning to breed the following spring. "Mrs. Turner," someone shouted behind her, but Violet was already moving, navigating through smoke toward the panicking horse. The mare reared and fought as Violet approached, terrified beyond recognition of human help. With soothing words that were lost in the roar of the fire, Violet managed to grab the horse's halter, using all her strength to keep the animal from trampling her. The fallen timber blocked the obvious escape route, but Violet spotted a narrow gap that might allow passage if the horse could be calmed enough to follow direction.
"Easy, lady," she murmured, stroking the mare's sweat-streaked neck. "Easy now."
The horse's eyes rolled wildly, but something in Violet's steady presence began to penetrate its panic. Slowly, carefully, she led the animal toward the gap, ducking under branches and navigating around smoldering debris. They were almost clear when a burning branch crashed down inches from them. The mare reared again, breaking free from Violet's grip and bolting through the gap. Violet wasn't as fortunate. Her skirt caught on a jagged tree limb, holding her in place as flames licked closer. She tugged desperately at the fabric, feeling the heat intensify around her. Smoke filled her lungs, making it impossible to call for help. Just as she freed herself, another burning branch fell, striking her shoulder and sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded through her and darkness edged her vision. Through the haze, she saw a figure charging toward her, heedless of the danger. Isaac. Then the world went black. Isaac had never known terror like the moment he saw Violet disappear into the smoke after his prize mare. Without conscious thought, he'd abandoned his position and charged after her, deaf to the shouts of his men. When he found her collapsed beneath a burning branch, his heart nearly stopped. He lifted her limp form as if she weighed nothing, shielding her with his body as he carried her through the gauntlet of flames back to safety. "Get her to the house," Peterson shouted as Isaac emerged from the smoke.
"We'll handle the fire." Isaac didn't need to be told twice.
He placed Violet carefully in a wagon and drove back to the ranch at breakneck speed, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and something deeper he couldn't name. Mrs. Abernathy gasped when he carried Violet's unconscious form into the house. "Sweet Jesus, is she?" "She's breathing," Isaac said tersely, "but she's hurt. Fetch water, bandages, and burn salve." He carried Violet not to the guest room, but to his own bedroom, laying her gently on the bed that had never been shared. Her face was smudged with soot, her honey-blonde hair singed at the ends, but what terrified him most was the angry red burn visible through her torn sleeve. As Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with supplies, the twins began crying from the kitchen where they'd been left in their wagon. "Bring them," Isaac ordered, surprising the cook. "They should be with their mother." While Mrs. Abernathy carefully cleaned and dressed Violet's burn, Isaac paced the room, occasionally stopping to peer anxiously at the unconscious woman. The twins, sensing the tension, fussed in their wagon until he impulsively lifted them out, one in each arm. "Your mama's going to be fine," he told them with more confidence than he felt. "She's the strongest woman I've ever known."
Mrs.
Abernathy glanced up from her work, a knowing expression crossing her face as she watched the ranch owner awkwardly comforting the babies. "The burn's not as bad as it looked," she reported. "Painful, but it should heal clean." "It's the smoke that worries me. We need to get her drinking when she wakes." "When," Isaac repeated, clinging to the certainty in the cook's voice. "Not if." "That girl's a fighter," Mrs. Abernathy assured him. "Takes more than a little fire to put out her kind of spirit." As if on cue, Violet stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips. Isaac was at her side instantly, the twins still in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as she focused on his face. "Isaac." She whispered, using his given name for the first time. "I'm here," he answered, his voice rougher than intended. "You're safe." She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured shoulder. "The fire." "Under control," he assured her. "The men are handling it." Her gaze shifted to the twins in his arms, and a smile touched her lips despite her pain. "You're holding my babies." "They wanted their mother," he said simply. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings too powerful to be denied any longer. Isaac felt the last of his defenses crumbling as he looked at this woman who'd risked her life for his horse, who cleaned barns and split wood and faced down prairie fires with the same quiet determination. "You could have been killed," he said, the words coming out harsher than intended, fear making his voice sharp. "Your mare would have died," she replied, unrepentant. "Diamond's lady." "She's important to you." "Not as important as," he stopped himself, suddenly aware of Mrs. Abernathy's presence. The cook cleared her throat. "I'll just take these little ones for some milk while you rest, Mrs. Turner." She gathered the twins from Isaac's arms with practiced ease. "Call if you need anything." When they were alone, Isaac sat carefully on the edge of the bed, mindful of Violet's injury. "You shouldn't have risked yourself like that," he said quietly. "I couldn't stand by and watch her burn," Violet replied, meeting his gaze steadily despite her weakened state. "Not when there was a chance to save her." Why? The question contained all his confusion about this woman who'd upended his carefully ordered existence. Violet looked away, a flush that had nothing to do with the fire creeping into her cheeks. "Because she matters to you," she said simply, "and you've been kind to us, to me." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Isaac found himself reaching for her hand, enfolding it in his much larger one. "When I saw you in the fire," he said, his voice low with barely contained emotion, "I realized something I've been fighting since the day I found you sleeping in my barn." Violet's eyes widened, hope and uncertainty warring in their depths. "What did you realize?" "That all my rules about avoiding attachments, about keeping love out of frontier life, they were wrong." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Or maybe they were right for the man I was, but not for the man I could be, the man I want to be." He took a deep breath, pushing through the fear that threatened to silence him. "I've been alone by choice, Violet. Convinced that love was a luxury the frontier couldn't sustain. But watching you these past months, your strength with the twins, your determination to build a life for them against all odds, I've seen that love isn't a weakness out here. It's the only thing worth fighting for." Tears filled Violet's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. "I told myself the same thing," she whispered. "After Robert died, that love was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. That survival was all that mattered." "And now?" Isaac asked, heart pounding as he waited for her answer. Her fingers tightened around his. "Now I think perhaps survival isn't enough, not for me." "Not for my children." Isaac reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "Stay," he said simply, "not as my barn cleaner, not in that cabin, here in this house with me." Violet's eyes searched his face. "What are you asking, Isaac?" I'm asking for a chance, he replied, to prove that love can survive the frontier, that together we could build something stronger than either of us could alone. A smile bloomed slowly across her face, transforming it despite the soot and exhaustion. I think I'd like that chance. Isaac leaned forward, pressing his lips gently to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long, solitary journey. When they parted, both were smiling despite the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Rest now, he said, reluctantly rising from the bed. The fire still needs fighting and you need healing. We'll have time for everything else. As he turned to leave, Violet caught his hand once more. Isaac, thank you for finding us in that barn that day. No, he replied softly. Thank you for showing me what I'd been missing all along. The fire was contained by nightfall, though crews would monitor the smoldering remains for days to ensure no new blaze erupted. The Diamond D had lost some timber and grazing land, but the ranch buildings and cattle were safe, as was Diamond's lady, who'd found her way back to the stables after Violet freed her. Isaac returned to the house after midnight, exhausted and smoke-stained but victorious. He checked first on Violet, finding her sleeping peacefully in his bed, her burned shoulder carefully bandaged. The twins slept nearby in a makeshift crib Mrs. Abernathy had arranged. For a long moment, he stood in the doorway, watching this unexpected family that had somehow become central to his existence. Then he quietly withdrew to clean up, unwilling to wake them with his disheveled state. When he returned, freshly washed and wearing clean clothes, he found Violet awake, attempting to soothe Ethan, who had begun fussing. Let me, Isaac offered, lifting the baby from her arms. To his surprise and delight, Ethan settled almost immediately against his chest, tiny fingers curling into his shirt. He likes you, Violet observed, wonder in her voice. Smart boy, Isaac replied with a smile, sitting carefully beside her on the bed. They sat in companionable silence, the sleeping baby between them, a bridge connecting their once separate worlds. Finally, Violet spoke. What happens now? People will talk. Isaac considered this. The frontier had its own moral code, sometimes stricter than back east in its insistence on propriety despite the harsh conditions. They would talk less if we were married, he said carefully, watching her reaction. Violet's eyes widened. Isaac, you don't need to. I'm not proposing out of obligation, he interrupted gently. Though I admit the timing might suggest otherwise, I'm proposing because I want you and these children in my life permanently. Because what I felt today when I thought I might lose you showed me exactly how much you've come to mean to me. He shifted Ethan to one arm so he could take her hand with the other. I don't expect an immediate answer. I know this is sudden and you've been through so much today, but I want you to know that's where my heart stands. Violet studied him in the soft lamplight, her expression thoughtful. When Robert died, she said finally, I thought I would never love again. Not because I couldn't imagine loving another man, but because I couldn't bear the thought of that kind of loss a second time. She looked down at their joined hands. The frontier takes so much from us, Isaac. I was afraid to risk my heart again. And now, he prompted softly. Now I think perhaps the frontier gives as well as takes, she replied, meeting his gaze. It brought me here to you. It showed me a strength in myself I didn't know I possessed, and it's offering us a chance at something neither of us thought possible. She squeezed his hand. I don't need time to consider, Isaac. My answer is yes. The joy that surged through him was unlike anything Isaac had experienced in his 26 years. Mindful of the sleeping baby and Violet's injury, he leaned forward to kiss her gently. We'll be married as soon as you're well enough to stand through the ceremony, he promised. Reverend Matthews comes through the first Sunday of each month. 2 weeks, Violet calculated, Mrs. Abernathy says I should be fully recovered by then. Isaac grinned. 2 weeks to prepare the ranch for a proper celebration. Peterson will complain about the disruption, but secretly he'll be pleased. The men too, they've been watching us dance around each other for months. Violet laughed softly. Have we been so obvious? Apparently to everyone but ourselves, Isaac admitted ruefully. Emma chose that moment to wake, her demanding cries filling the room. Isaac watched in amazement as Violet lifted her daughter with her good arm, the movement so natural it seemed she'd been born to motherhood. Would you like me to take her too? He offered. Violet shook her head. She needs feeding. A blush colored her cheeks as she realized what she'd said. Isaac stood, Ethan still sleeping peacefully against his chest. I'll give you privacy. And perhaps see what Mrs. Abernathy might have left in the kitchen for a late supper. Isaac, Violet called as he reached the door. He turned back to find her smiling at him, Emma already contentedly nursing at her breast, the image of Madonna and child so beautiful it stole his breath.
Thank you for everything.
In 2 weeks it won't be everything, he replied softly. It will be anything, everything, always. With those words hanging in the air between them like a promise, he left to put Ethan in his crib, his heart fuller than he'd ever believed possible. Word of the impending marriage spread quickly through the Diamond D and neighboring ranches. Most received the news with approval. Isaac Dalton was well respected, and the young widow's courage during the fire had earned her admiration. A few raised eyebrows at the speed of the engagement, but such was frontier life. Practical considerations often accelerated courtships that might have progressed more leisurely back east. For Violet, the 2 weeks of waiting passed in a dreamlike state. Her injury healed steadily under Mrs. Abernathy's care, and she found herself permanently installed in the main house, occupying the guest room while Isaac gallantly took a small room off his study. Not for long, he'd promised with a warmth in his eyes that made her blush. The twins thrived in the more spacious environment, delighting Mrs. Abernathy and charming even the most stoic ranch hands who stopped by the kitchen. Isaac spent every available moment with all three of them, reading to Violet in the evenings while the babies played on a blanket nearby, or walking the ranch grounds with a twin in each arm, proudly showing them the land that would one day be their inheritance. It was during one such walk, just days before the wedding, that Isaac broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "Violet," he began hesitantly, "there's something we haven't discussed about the twins." She looked up from adjusting Emma's bonnet. "What about them?" "Their name," he said. "After we're married, I was wondering if you would consider, that is, if you would allow me to." Understanding dawned and warmth flooded through her. "You want to give them your name?" "I want to adopt them," Isaac clarified, "legally, make them my children in every sense that matters if you're agreeable." Violet fought back tears, overwhelmed by the depth of his commitment not just to her but to her children. "You would do that, take on another man's children as your own?" Isaac stopped walking, shifting Ethan in his arms so he could face her directly. "They've never been another man's children to me, Violet. From the moment I found you sleeping with them in that barn, they've been important, precious, mine in every way that counts." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I know they'll always be Robert's children too. I would never ask you to erase his memory or pretend he didn't exist, but I want to be their father in truth, not just in daily life." A single tear escaped despite Violet's efforts to contain her emotion. "Nothing would honor me more than to see my children bear your name, Isaac, and I believe Robert would be pleased to know they would have a father who loves them as his own." Relief and joy crossed Isaac's face. "Then after the wedding we'll make it official, Emma and Ethan Dalton." The name sounded right, as if they'd always been meant to be. Violet nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she leaned against Isaac's side as they continued their walk, the four of them already a family in all the ways that truly mattered. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, a perfect early November Sunday. The entire Diamond D had been transformed for the occasion, with the main house scrubbed until it gleamed, and the great room decorated with pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the hands. Reverend Matthews arrived mid-morning, his weathered face breaking into a smile when Isaac explained the circumstances that had brought them to this day. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the circuit preacher observed. "From barn cleaner to mistress of the Diamond D in less than 3 months. If that isn't divine intervention, I don't know what is." Violet, sequestered in the guest room with Mrs. Abernathy helping her prepare, felt a curious calm. There were no wedding jitters, no last-minute doubts. The path that had led her here, through loss and hardship to this unexpected second chance, seemed somehow destined when viewed from the perspective of this day. Her dress was simple but lovely, cream-colored with lace trim that Mrs. Abernathy had sacrificed from her own wedding dress, carefully removed and resewn onto the bodice Violet would wear. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in soft waves, adorned with tiny white flowers. "You look beautiful," the older woman declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork, "like an angel come down to grace us mortals." Violet smiled, touching the lace reverently. "Thank you for this, for everything these past weeks." "Pshaw," Mrs. Abernathy waved away the gratitude. "I've waited 8 years to see that man properly settled." "You're doing me the favor, my dear." A knock at the door announced Peterson, who had offered to escort Violet in the absence of her father. The gruff foreman looked uncomfortable in his Sunday best but managed a rare smile when he saw her. "Miss Violet," he said, forgetting in the moment that she was technically still Mrs. Turner for a few more minutes. "You're a sight for these old eyes." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," she replied warmly. "Is Isaac ready?" Pacing a hole in the parlor floor, Peterson confirmed with a chuckle. Never seen the boss so nervous, not even when the bank almost foreclosed that first hard winter. The twins, dressed in their best and looking angelic despite the mischief that regularly sparkled in their blue eyes, were already in the parlor with one of the younger hands who had taken a particular shine to them. As Violet entered on Peterson's arm, she saw them first, then raised her eyes to find Isaac waiting by the fireplace. The look on his face as he saw her, wonder, joy, and something deeper that made her heart race, was everything she could have hoped for. He stood tall and handsome in a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his dark hair neatly combed, his gray eyes never leaving hers as she approached. The ceremony itself was brief, frontier practical yet deeply meaningful. Reverend Matthews spoke of partnership, of building something together that neither could create alone, of finding strength in one another against the hardships of life on the edge of civilization. When the time came for vows, Isaac surprised Violet by producing rings, not just a simple band for her, but matching gold circles for them both. "So everyone knows I'm equally claimed," he explained with a smile that was for her alone. Their I do's rang clear and certain in the crowded parlor, and when Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac's kiss held all the promise of the future they would build together. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the Diamond D had ever seen. Tables groaned with food prepared over days by Mrs. Abernathy and neighboring ranch wives. Music filled the air as hands who revealed unexpected talents on fiddle, harmonica, and guitar struck up dance tunes. The twins were passed from arm to arm, admired and fussed over by everyone present. As evening fell, lanterns were lit in the yard, and the dancing moved outdoors under the stars. Isaac found Violet by the punch bowl, where she was catching her breath after being whirled around by Peterson in a surprisingly energetic reel. "Happy Mrs. Dalton?" he asked, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "Happier than I ever imagined possible again," she answered honestly, leaning into his side as his arm circled her waist. They stood together watching the celebration, their celebration with a shared sense of wonder at how quickly life could change, how completely fate could reverse direction. "Do you know what today is?" Isaac asked suddenly. Violet looked up at him puzzled. "Our wedding day." "Besides that," he smiled, "it's exactly 3 months since you arrived at the Diamond D, 3 months since Peterson hired a widow just to clean the barn." The realization made Violet catch her breath. "3 months," she repeated softly. "From barn cleaner to mistress of the house, it doesn't seem possible." "It wasn't just possible," Isaac replied, turning to face her fully. "It was inevitable from the moment I found you sleeping with those twins in your arms. I just didn't know it yet." He cupped her face gently in his hands. "I thought I knew everything about surviving out here, Violet. Build something solid. Avoid complications, keep emotional entanglements at bay. But what I've learned from you is that surviving isn't living. Not really." His thumbs caressed her cheeks as he continued, "You and those babies, you've taught me that the frontier doesn't have to harden us. That we can find softness, tenderness, love even in the harshest circumstances. That building a life worth living means building it with people who matter." Tears glistened in Violet's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of completion. "And you've taught me that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story," she whispered. "That sometimes it's just the beginning of a different one, a better one." Their kiss, witnessed by half the county yet somehow intensely private, sealed these truths between them. When they parted, both were smiling with the certainty of having found something precious and unexpected in a land known more for taking than giving. "I believe we're expected to lead another dance," Isaac said, offering his arm with exaggerated formality that made Violet laugh. "Lead on, Mr. Dalton," she replied, placing her hand on his arm. "I'll follow you anywhere." As they moved toward the dancing, Violet caught sight of the twins, now sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle nearby, exhausted from the excitement of the day. These children who had been her reason for continuing when grief threatened to overwhelm her were now part of something larger, a family, a legacy, a future bright with promise. From barn cleaner to beloved wife in 3 short months. From desperate widow to mistress of a thriving ranch. from believing the frontier could only take to discovering all it could give. The music swelled around them as Isaac swept her into the dance, and Violet surrendered herself to the joy of this moment and all the moments to come.
5 years later.
The Diamond D Ranch spread before them in the golden light of late afternoon, a kingdom built on hard work, determination, and love. Isaac stood on the porch of the main house, his arm around Violet's waist as they watched their children playing in the yard. Emma and Ethan, now nearly 6, raced around with their 3-year-old brother Robert, named for the father they would never know but whose memory was honored in their new family. Baby Sarah, just beginning to toddle, sat nearby on a blanket, carefully supervised by Mrs. Abernathy, who refused all talk of retirement despite her advancing years. Hard to believe how much has changed, Isaac mused, pressing a kiss to Violet's temple. She leaned into him, her hand resting on the slight swell of her abdomen where their 5th child grew. Remember what you said when you proposed. That love wasn't a weakness out here, but the only thing worth fighting for. Isaac nodded, his eyes following Emma as she carefully helped little Sarah stand. I meant it then, but I understand it better now. Everything we've built, the expanded ranch, the new breeding program, even the school you started for the Hands children, it all comes from that truth. Violet turned in his arms to face him fully. Do you ever regret it? Taking on a widow and her twins, all the complications that came with us. Isaac's laugh was warm and genuine. Regret the best decision I ever made, not for a single moment. His hand joined hers over their unborn child. This life we've built together is everything I never knew I wanted until I found you sleeping in that barn with those babies in your arms. The memory still had the power to move them both, that moment when everything changed, when the barriers they'd built against love began to crumble. Mama, Papa, Ethan called, running toward them with something clutched in his small hands. Look what I found. Isaac lifted the boy easily, settling him on the porch railing.
What treasure have you discovered, son?
Ethan opened his hands to reveal a small bird's nest, perfectly formed and empty of eggs. Can I keep it?
For my collection.
Of course, Violet answered, smoothing his dark hair, so like Isaac's that strangers often remarked on the resemblance, never suspecting he wasn't born a Dalton.
It's beautiful.
Like our nest, Isaac added with a wink at Violet, getting fuller all the time. Ethan grinned, slid down from the railing, and ran back to show his siblings his find. Isaac and Violet remained on the porch, watching as their family, the family they'd created against all odds in this unforgiving yet beautiful land, played in the fading light of day. I love you, Isaac Dalton, Violet said softly, the words no less powerful for having been spoken countless times over the past 5 years. Thank you for giving us a home. I love you, Violet Dalton, he replied, his arms tightening around her.
Thank you for teaching me what home truly means.
As the sun set over the Diamond D, painting the land in hues of gold and amber, they stood together, surrounded by the legacy of love they'd built. A love that had not just survived the frontier but flourished there, proving that even in the harshest circumstances, the human heart could find its way home. The poor widow hired just to clean the barn had become the heart of a thriving ranch, and the twins a rancher once found sleeping in her arms were now the foundation of a dynasty that would endure for generations to come. All because 2 wounded souls had found the courage to believe that love, not isolation, was the true key to surviving the wild frontier.